Everywhere around the world, there's a bunch of different kinds of people. Can you name them all? The movie Clerks, if you've never seen it, has a very good line. It's a movie about two store clerks, and one of them makes the comment that this job would be pretty good if it wasn't for the effing customers. He curses. I don't really know if you want me to here or not, though. It's something that I think about a lot because working with people is a larger part of most jobs than people think it should be. I have a colleague of mine who got a degree in computer programming specifically because he got a degree in computer programming specifically because he didn't want to talk to anybody. He just wanted to work. Little did he realize that was half of his job, was talking to clients. So it helps if you know people. It helps if you know how people act and how we think about people, because it almost always makes it a little bit more difficult. One of the many things that affects how we can interpret any situation is the people in it and how they identify and the groups they're in. So it's going to be something we're going to start talking about. Let's get a good working definition before we do anything else. The term we're going to be using is culture. The ideas, customs, beliefs, behaviors, and traditions of a group of people is as good of a definition as you're really going to get. It doesn't have to mean big cross-national things either. There's little cultures within little cultures. The term subculture comes up sometime, but we can just refer to them all as culture for the purpose of our discussion. And I'm here to tell you that you are, in some way, in the middle of one of the more complex cultures available, the University of Toledo. Now, does going to the University of Toledo make you part of a culture? Well, go back to the definition. Is it a group of people? Yes. Do they have a shared identity? Well, yeah, they're all part of UT. Do they have a uniform? Well, not really, but UT colors, which means there are traditions involved, particularly when you get around things like homecoming. Do the people at UT experience something with the other people at UT that people who don't go to UT wouldn't get? Yeah. Quite a lot, actually. So that's as good of a culture as you're going to find right now. But the thing is, UT is not homogenous. Not at all. There are tons of ways to divide up the student population. Demographics can give you just a million different terms. And when we think college specific, we can get a million different more. But rather than try to throw more terms at you, let's just go over the UT culture. Now, the first mistake people make when they think about the UT culture is that they think everybody here is students. I'm not a student. You do have faculty and staff who are also part of here. And this involves not only your teachers, but the secretaries. It's a real position of power, people. People who work in admissions, people who work in records, people who are in the janitorial. Imagine how this place would look if nobody tried cleaning it. It means the University Police Department. All kinds of people other than students go here. And these aren't all homogenous groups either, because you could also break up, say, the faculty into tenure track and tenured, non-tenured, teaching assistants, and adjuncts. Adjuncts are part-time teachers. When we can't fill out our entire roster, we'll hire someone to teach a class or two. I did this job for a good 2 years. It was horrific because I got paid next to nothing and never knew when I was going to work. Teaching assistants. When you go to graduate school here, In a lot of places, actually, part of graduate school is learning how to teach by throwing you in front of a classroom. Non-tenure versus tenure. Tenured faculty are like your full professors and such. Part of their job is to research and publish and be on committees. They're supposed to be an expert in their field, and they're supposed to help with university administration. Non-tenured faculty, like me, are people who don't have a research obligation and don't have a service obligation. My job is to do nothing but teach. Of course, that means I teach more than tenure track faculty, but that's how it goes. Now, are these all separate groups? Would you call them each their own individual culture? Well, the people within the groups tend to think so. The first year I got my full-time position, I decided I was going to be a good department citizen and go to all the department meetings. Last meeting I went to, one of the tenured faculty was holding a conversation with me, and then another tenured faculty member walked in, and in mid-conversation, the guy turned his back to me. There was clearly a separation there. So, separation within faculty. But I mentioned TAs, so that means we have to separate out grad students from the regular students. And because they have a different burden, they have a different place in the university, they're a slightly more professional student class. We could break up the students because there are those who've been here 1 year, been here 2 years, been here 3 years, be here 4 years. The freshmen, the sophomores, the juniors, the seniors. Does that mean all of those people are doing the same thing? Nah, of course not. The university is structured by being divided into 11 different colleges, like the College of Business, the College of Pharmacy, the College of Arts and Letters, so on and so forth. And each of these colleges has a number of departments. Arts and Letters, for instance, has 40. So I'm kind of simplifying things on the bottom shelf. These are interesting divisions, all of them, because they do cut across the student divide, they cut across the faculty, they cut across the staff. Even within each individual department, though, they're not all homogeneous masses. Take English language and literature. There's a distinction between composition and literature classes. Within literature, the other 3 green boxes on the top of that square, there's a difference between people who are doing poetry and people who are doing prose and people who are doing drama. Even within each of those fields, though, you can probably break it up according to the kind of thing they study. Someone who's doing Renaissance poetry is going to have something more in common with someone who's doing Renaissance drama than they would someone who's doing poetry that's postmodern. Divisions can cut multiple ways. And of course, even within this department, you've got the faculty, the staff, the various student divisions at work, too. Speaking of the students, we can talk about other ways how students tend to get grouped. And the language of demographics works a whole lot in here. We can go by gender. Male, female, non-binary. Yes, I know there's a lot more divisions in there, and it's not as absolute as 3 things, but bear with me, there's only so much space I can do here. Gender is not the same thing as sexuality, so we could also divide up according to sexuality. Straight, gay, bisexual, and yes, I know there's a bunch of other sexualities there, but the chart's going to get complex enough for us anyway. We could think in terms of race, ethnicity. White, African American, Latino, Asian, and yeah, we could do more of those too. Interesting side note, is everyone who's Asian on campus an Asian American? No. There are students from Asia. We have a sizable Chinese population. We have a sizable Japanese population on campus. Do they have some immediate connection to the Japanese American and Chinese Americans? No, not really. Yet we call them all Asian for some reason. As if everyone in Asia, everyone in Southeast Asia, likes each other and gets along. That ain't the case. There have been some traditional feuds between the Japanese and the Koreans, for instance, and we could break down a lot more of them. So I guess we could when we're talking about Asians, divide them up into the countries they come from. But even that's not really good enough because, China has a ton of ethnic groups, just a ton of them. Are they all the same? Do they all get treated the same? And an interesting thing that tends to happen on a college campus is international students tend to hang out with a lot more international students than they do American students. Because even though they might be from different places, their experience of being an international student kind of connects them to other international students. Is everybody here people who are straight out of high school in the undergraduate area? No, there are traditional and non-traditional. Non-traditional is anyone who has taken time between getting their high school degree and starting college. It can be anywhere from someone who took 3 or 4 years off to save money or someone who's going back to school after 20 years. When I started doctoral school, one of my best friends was a guy who was the same age as my father who decided he wanted to change in careers and always wanted to get a PhD. So, there's a variety of people. And if you've been out working in the world a while, you do bring a different set of life experiences to the classroom and to wherever you are in the university than someone who comes just straight out of high school. I did a little of both. I went to community college for a few years, took a few years off, then went back to a 4-year institution when I was very much a non-traditional at that age. I can tell you that when you go back to college at the age of 24, you look at it a lot differently than you did 18. Anyway, we're working on dividing up the university population. Traditional, non-traditional, these, of course, spread across all the other divides we've already talked about. College, department, discipline, first year, second year, third year, so on and so forth. There are the people who live on campus and the people who commute. There is a commuter student lounge somewhere on campus because there's an attempt to build community amongst the commuters. And driving to school every day is a much different experience than living at school. Now, speaking of those who live at school, do they all live in the same place? Of course not. I don't know off the top of my head how many different dorms there are, but there are a number of residence halls. And if you're in one of them, you probably have more in common with other people from your same building than you do from someone in a building across town. But even so, each of these buildings has floors, and you're around people on your own floor a lot more than you're a floor 3 people down, so you probably have things in common with them that you don't have with others. Think it's getting complex? Hold on. Because another category that cuts across all of these is class. Do you come from a lower class background? Do you come from a middle class background? Do you come from an upper class background? And this is always an interesting one in America because everyone in America tends to think they're middle class, even though they don't fit the definition of middle class. There are a lot of people who think they're middle class but are really lower class. There's a lot of people who think they're really middle class but they're upper class. I heard my nephew and my niece one day talk about something, and I heard one of them say, it's hard being a middle-class kid, and I'm thinking, your dad owns 2 restaurants. You're not really middle class. Class is just one of those really strange identities. We could also talk about people who have interests other than the classes they take. Athletes, for instance. We can divide up the athletes into the club athletics and the varsity athletics. And I'm not saying one is any better than the other. I got my doctorate at Bowling Green, and while I was here, Bowling Green didn't have a great football team or a great basketball team. But I'll tell you, Bowling Green is traditionally a club rugby powerhouse. They have won any number of national titles. But an athlete would obviously have something more in common with another athlete than they would someone who's not athletes, at least to a certain level. And of course, you can break this down into the individual sports. We could do the same on the other side too, but we've only got so much time and space, and this graphic was taking me long enough to do. So we have the individual sports: basketball, tennis, golf, baseball, football, so on and so forth. Each of those can be divided. Say we'll take football, which is this little area over in the corner that I just divided into offense and defense. Then we divided it into starters versus not starters. Over on the offensive side, we divided it up into several groups because the linemen share something in common with the linemen that they don't with the wide receivers. Running backs are a different group. Quarterbacks are a different group. Then, yeah, we're still going. We have clubs and activities. These can be anything from student government to the chess club to the anime club to the various frats, which we could have divided this into fraternities and sororities, and then the individual Greek houses. And we could have done a whole lot more. We didn't talk about people who are local as opposed to people who are out of state. We didn't talk about the different social circles people go into. If you hang around certain people, you have a culture developing with them that you don't share with everyone else. We didn't talk about where people work. We didn't talk about the party culture on campus, and that's always a big element of any college situation. We didn't talk about relationship status. We didn't talk about outside interests. So we could have made this a whole lot more complex than we did, but I figured that we were getting close to the point of this being illegible, if we were not there already. So the problem is it's hard to get a grasp on something that's this complex, so we need to go to a specific example. It's a good thing to think about in your papers, too. So instead of focusing on the whole picture, let's focus on a specific person. Fred. Who is Fred, you might ask? I kind of picked him out of random and made up an identity for him. So let's meet Fred. Fred is a football player, which means he is in the athletes, and he shares something with the athletes he doesn't share with the others, but he shares something with the football players. He's a member of the offense, so he knows more offensive players than defensive players. He's a lineman, so he has a very specific position on the team. He's not a star just yet. He's a second stringer, and he's a sophomore on campus, so he's a hard worker. He's been working up to a better role. Is this going to affect who he talks to? Yeah, he's going to have more in common with the people at his level than he would at people who are the stars of the team. He doesn't just play football here. It's not like he gets a salary for playing football. This isn't OSU or anything. He's also a student, so he also has to take classes. What classes does he take? Well, he really wants to be an engineer. And it's not just being an engineer. He knows that very few football players make it professional. The numbers are staggeringly low. And even if you do make it professional, your average career will top out at 3 years. So you got to be able to do something else. And he's a smart guy, this Fred. You got to be a lineman because you have to know all the plays. You have to be able to react quickly. And he enjoys robotics. Why not? Is it what we think of when we think of football players? Not really, but there's no reason why this couldn't happen. If he's into robotics and he's an engineering student as a sophomore, you gotta imagine that he's kind of smart and does good. So, he's in the Honor Society. Where does Fred live? Well, this is going to have some effect on the people he hangs out with. He's only a sophomore, so he lives on campus. In Ottawa East. Why not? Now, this isn't a full picture of Fred either, because Fred comes from somewhere. UT traditionally recruits fairly heavily in the Cleveland area, so we get a lot of people from Cleveland. And if you're Fred and you meet someone else who's from Cleveland, you instantly have a connection you don't have with anyone else. Fred comes from a working class background. He's not a rich kid. He's used to working for things. He's not the most physically gifted person in the world at first, but he's worked his way into being a good football player. The working class outlook. Fred's African American. And as we all know, that does kind of color your experiences, particularly nowadays. Because Fred's also an activist and involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. Good for Fred. He cares about the world. Fred is a working class guy, which means when they're not playing football, he needs to do something to get money because no one's sending him thousands and thousands of dollars to go out and party every night. So Fred works at McDonald's. Do we think about football players working at McDonald's? No, we kind of imagine that football players must be people who have everything handed to them. I've taught 2 years in a row, I taught summer classes of incoming athletes, mostly football players, and those guys were impressive students. They are far from the dumb jock image that most people tend to have. Really smart, very driven people. So, if Fred needs money, he's going to work for it. We've already established that Fred has a certain intellectual lineage going on. So it makes sense that since he's in such a strategic sport, he likes strategy, which is why he's also in the chess club. Do we think about football player and chess club together? Not really. No reason why it can't happen, though. Fred's also a partier. You know, there's this image that college students in general are all partiers, but more students don't drink than do. It's just the ones we happen to hear about. Now, because Fred's living on campus and living in a dorm, you know that the university tends to have a sense of humor about who they put you with, right? And Fred ended up with a weird guy his first year and ended up getting along with him, but ended up also sharing some of his interests. So Fred is now into anime because his old roommate was into anime. Again, anime football players? Well, this is less ridiculous now than it would have been 5 years ago. Anime is much broader culturally now than it was 5 years ago. It's less weird than it was 5 years ago. We've done a lot with Fred. We haven't hit a lot of elements of his life, but we've given him a nice full life. And we've seen elements of this that seem to clash with other elements of it. There's nothing legal preventing a McDonald's employee from also being a lineman. There's nothing illegal in being a member of the anime club and a football player. Why can't a lineman be a robotics guy? But we can change all of this, and we can change Fred's life and make it infinitely more complex by adding one more identity. If Fred's gay, that does change things, does it not? We're in a much different place culturally now than we were even 5 years ago, let alone 10, 15, 20, but there are still places where being gay will have greater effect on the person than others. Will, for instance, his engineering students care? I don't really know the engineering culture. Someone who's closer to it might have to tell me. Would the honor students care? I don't know if Fred is going to go out of his way to bring it up in that area, probably just because there's other things going on, but it's not going to be his focus there. After all, he's more than just a gay guy. Does his roommate know? Well, again, it kind of depends on the roommate you end up getting. If Fred can be wowed by anime, there's no reason why his roommate can't have his horizons broadened and they get along. Does he make it an open secret with everyone on his floor? Probably not. Is there a problem with a McDonald's employee being gay? I really have a hard time seeing it. Is there a problem with someone being gay and in the anime club? Anime club seems to be a fairly accepting group of people from everything I know. What about being gay and being in the Black Lives Matter movement? Social activist people tend to care a lot less about such things. What about being gay and being in the chess club? I don't see how that could possibly come into a mega conflict, but you never know. Maybe there's ultra right-wing chess club players. It doesn't seem like a likely thing. Would being gay affect how he gets along as a football player? You betcha. Now, society is becoming more and more open, and people are becoming more and more accepting. But football is still an ultra-masculine area. Masculinity doesn't have anything to do with sexuality, but the uber-masculinity of a football team does kind of change the environment, particularly for someone who's gay. It probably wouldn't be a good idea to be completely open with everyone on the team. I'm not saying athletes are bad people. Every athlete I've had has been great. But how many openly gay football players are there? There's been a number of them who've come out after they've played. Remember that one guy who came out before the draft, and Sam, I can't remember last name. You know who I'm talking about, though. He did get drafted down in the 6th round, got dropped, got dropped from another team's practice squad, got dropped from a Canadian football team practice squad. Yet he was a Heisman Trophy winner. Might it have something to do with the sexuality? So Fred's life can get a little bit confusing. But you know something? This is far from an abnormal situation, because everybody is a mixture of a bunch of people. We're different people based on where we go. If I'm hanging out with my daughter, I'm not the same person as I am talking to you. I'm not the same person when I'm playing a show that I am in either of the situations. Would you talk to your grandmother the way you talk to people at a kegger? Doubtful. So we have a slightly different attitude towards the people around us depending on where we happen to be. There is actually a term for this. Irving Goffman, a sociological guru guy, if you take sociology, you'll hear his name a lot, came up with the concept of dramaturgy, where we play roles. Is there a true Dr. DuBose? Is the true Dr. DuBose the teacher? Is the true Dr. DuBose the father? Is the true Dr. DuBose the husband? Is the true Dr. DuBose the musician? Well, according to the theory of dramaturgy, none of the above. There isn't really a single me. I just am a different person wherever I happen to be. At least according to this theory. And know that the various roles can come into conflict quite heavily. The two big takeaways from this is when we bring an identity, there's a couple things that end up happening. Context gets to be a tremendously important part of how we interpret things. When you start to talk about how people identify themselves, where they are tends to matter. When you talk about how other people identify people they see, context matters. And identity, man, is a complex field. There aren't simple answers here. In fact, the more you dig, the more confusing. Fun. Now, I'm not going to say something silly like people mess everything up. But people do make issues a whole lot more complex. If everything was nice, dry, and scientific, we could pinpoint this and pinpoint that, then it'd be easy to make sense of the world. Unfortunately, people tend to be relatively complex. And I know that when you're dealing with groups of people, it's easy to say, hey, this person's not like everyone else. But you have to change your scope sometime, because people do think in terms of group, even if we're not all really the same. We tend to treat people in a group as if they're the same, and that changes how we see the world. So it's an important factor, and one that we just really have to consider. See you in the next video.